It's my honor to present to you our state representative for District 105, that's Irving and Grand Prairie, and he's going to give us an update on the last legislative session, and he's a member of the Grand Prairie Rotary Club, so we're honored to have you here this evening, Representative Anderson.
Thank you so very much. I'm glad to be here, and thank you guys for having me today. This is the first time I've ever done one of these like this, so it's kind of like being on our training that we go through on television and on camera. So one of the things we're taught is the microphone is always hot. And so I heard Bill a while ago say that he was eavesdropping. There is no question the microphone is always hot. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what happened in this last legislative session. And one of the things that I want to make sure I spend plenty of time on are some of the constitutional amendments that we will all be voting on later on this year. And it's an interesting time. This last session was an interesting time because for the first time, this was actually my second time. For those that don't recall, I was elected first in 2011, or in 2010. I served in 2011 in a session that was a redistricting session. For those in the Dallas area, Dallas County lost a couple of seats, and I was one of those that was in a very marginal district. And so when it was redrawn, I was paired with another Republican, so I sat out for 2 years and came back in this last legislative session. And one of the things, I've spoken to a lot of Rotary clubs, a lot of Lions clubs, a lot of other service clubs. I try to keep this as nonpartisan as possible. I try to make sure, because Rotary is not a political club, but they are politically active. And I see some folks shaking their heads on screen. Yes, and I try to do that. And if for some reason I don't, Linda, please kick me under the table, or either that or pinch me or something like that. I will tell you a little bit about the makeup of the Texas legislature this year. We had 98 Republicans, there were 52 Democrats, and there were 24 freshman legislators. That is, it's not unusual to have 20 to 30 new faces in the Texas House. One of the things that is very interesting is that I was looking at the composite picture from my session in 2011, and over the last two sessions, almost half the faces that were there are no longer there. That's just the way that the election cycles work. In the Senate, by comparison, you have 20 Republicans and 11 Democrats. And I'm going to say something here. There were 8 freshman senators. Now, that is highly unusual to have that many new faces in the Texas Senate. And the Texas Senate made one of the most substantive changes that we as a legislative body have ever seen. And I will put this out for a question, and I don't know exactly how this works, but I'm going to ask this question of the group, and I don't know whether you type it in or you speak it in. Does anyone know what the single biggest change that happened this legislative session that hasn't happened in the last 70 years? Does anybody know the answer to that question? And everybody in here is shaking their head.
Is it the parties in both the House and Senate?
No, it's not the parties of the House and Senate, because the Texas House and Senate have been majority Republican for the better part of 15 years, I believe is the number. But in 2011, Republicans actually had a supermajority in the Texas House. We had 101 Republicans. But the biggest change this year had to do with what happened in the Texas Senate. The Texas Senate for the last 70 years has had what they have called the blocker rule. And what it was that you had to have 21 senators who agreed to bring a bill up for debate. Now, that didn't mean that they had to vote for it on the floor, but you had to have 21 state senators to bring something up for debate. Well, when you only have 20 Republicans in the Texas Senate, that meant you had to have someone from the Democratic side come over to bring a bill up for debate. And what that meant was there was a lot of legislation over the past few years that's just never been brought up before the Texas Senate. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick came in, and one of his signature pieces of things that he ran on was changing that. And the way you change it is their rules votes only take 50%. So in their rules session, they decided that they would change that from 2/3 to 3/5. Now, the reason that's important is now it only takes 19 votes to bring something up for debate on the Texas Senate floor. Well, when you have 20 Republicans in the Texas Senate, you can tell that some things are now going to come to the Senate floor that would never have come in the past. And that's some of the thing, and some of the legislation we'll talk about has heretofore not even come before the Texas Senate. A couple things. Another big change in the Texas Senate. The makeup of of committees is typically drawn along the lines of committee chairs that are, if you have 2/3 of Republicans, that means 2/3 of your committee chairmen are Republicans, 1/3 are Democrat. That didn't exactly happen this time. This time there were only 2 Democrats appointed as committee chairs. And that was also a significant departure from history. And so in the Texas House, you have basically 2/3 of the makeup are Republicans and 1/3 Democrats, and that's the way that the committees are set out. And so that also was a significant change that happened this session. A couple things, I'll talk about some key issues that we had, and you'll see me check time here. I want to make sure I'm respectful of everyone's time. Key issues, we had budget, education, tax cuts. It was an interesting time in the Texas legislature because when we went in, there was not a discussion of were we going to have a tax cut? The question was what kind of tax cut are we going to have? Are we going to have a tax cut of sales tax, property tax, business taxes, fees that are charged to various licensing groups, or a combination of all of the above? It wasn't a question of if, it was what kind. And so that was something that we'll talk about as well. Transportation was a huge issue this time around. Healthcare is obviously a key issue, as well as border security. And for those of us especially in the Metroplex, that is one of the hot button issues, believe it or not, is border security and illegal immigration. So we took some of those up. So let's talk about the budget. The budget in this session of the legislature was actually increased by less than 2% per year. Now, I want you to let that sink in for a minute. 2% per year is less than population growth plus inflation. Now, we were able to do that all the while doing some of the other things that we did. So we actually, when I say left money on the table, as a legislative body, we didn't spend all the money that was available. And I challenge you to look at just about any legislative body, whether it's federal or any other state, to see who didn't spend all the money they had available. We left, the projection is roughly $11 billion in what's called we call it the rainy day fund. And we left $11 billion there, and that should be used for one-time expenditures that are extraordinary type issues that come up. Some things that it's been used for in the past are to certify the budget if a previous budget cycle we were short on revenue in order to make sure the budget balanced. We used, in fact, in 2011, I think we used $2.3 billion from the rainy day fund to true up the budget. If you have another hurricane, Hurricane Ike or something like that, that's the type of things. They're extraordinary items, and it's basically the state savings account, and we left $11 billion in the state's rainy day fund. It's also, its technical word is the Economic Stabilization Fund. As part of the budget, we as the state, we approved tax cuts of almost $4 billion. And those tax cuts came in the form of a property tax cut that you will be able to vote on as part of one of the constitutional amendments that raises the exemption for your homes from $15,000 to $25,000 for public education purposes. There were also some licensing fees that were reduced, and we reduced the margins tax on our small businesses by 25%. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to a point where the margins tax, we're actually able to remove the margins tax entirely. Our budget increased less than 2% per year. I made a prediction 4 years ago in my town hall, and he's fine. I think he is anyway. Yeah. Did we lose anybody there? Okay, it was just a screensaver popping on. Our all funds budget, which basically the Texas budget is divided into two pieces. It's divided into state funds and then federal reimbursement funds. And they're roughly $100 billion apiece. They fluctuate one side or the other. But I made a prediction 4 years ago when I was in office that said if we don't get a handle on our Health and Human Services budget, that portion of the budget will soon become the largest portion of the Texas budget. 4 years ago, it encompassed 28% of the state budget. This year, it's 37% of our state budget. I want you to let that number sink in a little bit. Our Health and Human Services side, which is our Medicaid reimbursement rates, our CHIP, our welfare programs, are now 37% of the Texas budget. 36. The actual number is 36.85, and the reason it's critical that it's 36.85 is the largest portion of the budget is what everyone is really concerned about is public education. Our public education budget is 37.42%. 4 years ago, it was 44% of our state budget. And so what I predicted 4 years ago is starting to come true, where our Health and Human Services budget is getting to be where it's the largest portion of our state budget. And there are arguments pro and con about expanding Medicaid and what that would do. If we expanded Medicaid, it would put another $2 to $4 billion per election cycle or per budget cycle into that. It would grow it exponentially. So we're not here for a policy debate, but that's one of the items that I'm sure in the next legislative cycle we're going to have to deal with as well. Education. We put another $1.5 billion back into public education. The per pupil funding is now higher than it was in 2011. The Texas House tried to put $3 billion into it. It didn't work out that way with the way the Senate, we moved some money around. And so we only put $1.5 billion back into public ed. That puts us well over our per pupil figures in 2011. We also put $130 million to a pre-K grant program for high quality pre-K throughout the state. We removed some criminal penalties for truancy for students, and we increased our accountabilities for public schools by creating a rating system that's an A through F rating system. A lot of parents don't understand what recognized, acceptable, unacceptable. They didn't understand what all that meant, but we have been very hard pressed to find anyone that doesn't know what an A through F rating is. Anybody who's gone to public school know A, B, C, and D, and then F, and I still have never understood what happened to E. Somewhere back in there. Maybe not everybody knows. Most people know. I talked about taxes already. Transportation is another big one that we addressed this session by removing we removed diversions from the state highway fund, which puts a tremendous amount of money back into our public transportation system. We were paying for a lot of things like DPS and some law enforcement stuff out of our highway fund that we didn't need to. We've moved all those diversions back into transportation. What a lot of people don't realize is of the 20 cents per gallon of gas in tax, A nickel of that 20 cents goes to public education. That's done by the Texas Constitution. If any change there would take a change to the Texas Constitution, and we did not do that this session. But the other diversions, we took those out. We also have passed what's called an SJR, which is a Senate Joint Resolution, that somebody took their phone off mute, I think. That puts basically $2.5 billion from the state sales and use tax into transportation. We've also at 35% of the motor fuel sales tax after an initial $5 billion. So we increased TxDOT's budget by $1.2 billion. We also put a provision in that directs TxDOT to inventory all tolls to eventually end our reliance on toll roads. That's the one thing that a lot of people are really, really upset about, is that every new highway being built is a toll road. And we have put some, as I tell people, we did not dig this toll road problem, this toll road hole over one legislative cycle. We built it over about the last 20 years, and it's going to take us a little while to dig back out of that hole. Also, Proposition 1 funds that were passed in the 84th legislative session provided funding for over 200 projects throughout the state of Texas. We talked a little bit about health care, but there were some other things that we did do. We increased funding for behavioral health and substance abuse services by $151 million. We established a tuition repayment program for mental health professionals to try and keep mental health professionals here in the state of Texas. And then on to border security. We provided $800 million in additional border security to the budget. Again, this is one that, when in polling, was one of the biggest issues that we found throughout the state of Texas, is people wanting the state to do something. Well, what the state can do is provide additional law enforcement, and that's what that $800 million is to do, is to provide additional law enforcement down on our southern border. It hires more DPS troopers. It creates additional checkpoints at our border. It also creates some additional penalties for human trafficking at a state level, so that those that are caught in human trafficking, we have some additional penalties there. We also now have a requirement for the state to use E-Verify for any of the state agencies. Any state agency hiring, you have to use E-Verify. One of the things that's really important to the district in kind of Irving, Farmers Branch, Carrollton, Dallas. For those that don't know, we're having earthquakes in North Texas, and Linda's felt them. I have been there where I've felt them, and it's an unnerving sensation if you've never had it happen. One of the things that Texas has never had any dollars allocated towards researching seismic activity. And there is what is called the Bureau of Economic Geology within the University of Texas that has been allocated $4.5 million to put what's called TexNet seismic monitoring program. And what it does, they will use monitoring stations all over the state and some mobile units that they will have here in North Texas to try and pinpoint what's going on, what's causing the increased seismic activity here in North Texas. And I'm very grateful to Representative Rafael Anchia, who worked with the committee on obtaining those funds for that. A couple of other things before I open it up for questions. I want to talk about constitutional amendments. Constitutional amendments are some things we're going to get to vote on in November. The proposed changes have to be approved by 2/3 of the members of both the Texas House and the Texas Senate. So it's very difficult to get a constitutional amendment passed. It takes at least 2/3 of both houses, and without supermajorities, it still is a difficult task. So our Texas voters have the opportunity to approve the amendments with a simple majority vote. So that election is going to be November 3rd. It's a constitutional amendment election. October 5th is the last day you can register to vote for that election. So if you're not registered, if you know people who are not registered, please make sure you get them registered. I was at an event this weekend at the local YMCA talking about voter registration. This is neither a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. This is a voter thing. This is a citizenship issue. And I encourage you, if you know people who are not registered to vote, get them a voter registration card and have them mail it in. Early voting for this election begins on October 19th, and it will end on October 30th. The first proposition to vote on is what's called Proposition 1, and it is the constitutional amendment that increases the amount of the residential homestead exemption for a taxation for public school purposes from $15,000 to $25,000. This is your property tax cut, and it is roughly $1.5 billion to $2 billion, depending upon who's counting the numbers, of tax relief that's provided to the general public. That is Proposition 1. There are people that are very supportive of it. There are some people that are against it. I can't tell you whether to vote for it or against it. I can just tell you that this is your tax cut that you have the opportunity to vote on. Proposition 2 authorizes the legislature to provide an exemption from ad valorem taxes for part of the market value for a disabled veteran's surviving spouse. There was a loophole that needed to be closed, and as it pertains to the surviving spouses of disabled veterans. What was happening is you have someone who has a tax exemption on their property. The disabled veteran passes away, and there was not a mechanism in place for the surviving spouse to retain that tax exemption. And we were running into a lot of issues with that. And we put some safeguards within the law to make sure that if the widow remarries, that exemption goes away. And so that's what that proposition is. Proposition 3 has to do with a requirement that state officers elected by voters statewide reside in the Texas Capitol. With the advent of technology, just like we're doing today, there are certain statewide office holders that it would be more beneficial for them to be able to live somewhere other than Austin. Now, obviously, the governor has the governor's mansion. Lieutenant governor is there, but you have like the attorney general is one that the position can be done from anywhere. Is just one example of that.
That they don't have to live?
That they don't have to live in Austin. Right now they do. This would allow them to be able to live elsewhere. And what it will do, as the people who are for it say, it will open up, it will make it easier for people in rural parts of the state to run for statewide office if they're still able to take care of, to live in, whether it be West Texas or in other parts of the state. Proposition 4 is a constitutional amendment that authorizes professional sports team charitable foundations to conduct charitable raffles. Now, believe it or not, a sports team is limited to 2 charitable raffles per year under current law. What this allows them to do is to have at their home games is to have what are called 50-50 raffles. If you've ever participated in a 50-50 raffle, 50% goes to the charity and 50% goes to whoever wins. There are safeguards that are put in that it's only cash and it only applies to the large charitable foundations. In other states where this has been done, you have professional teams that increase their charitable foundations by millions of dollars by being able to do this. That's money that's then put back into the community under their charitable foundations. It applies to people like the Dallas Mavericks, San Antonio Spurs, Texas Rangers, Dallas Cowboys, Houston Texans. The major professional teams is what that applies to. There's also a Proposition 5 that authorizes counties with a population of 7,500 or less to perform private road construction and maintenance. And what that allows, small municipalities to do, small counties to do, is to do their own, they can engage private road construction and maintenance. It saves a great deal of tax dollars and makes it much more efficient for them to, that's what the proponents say that it does. Prop 6 is a constitutional amendment that recognizes the right of people to hunt, fish, and harvest wildlife subject to laws that promote wildlife conservation. Now, you might be looking at me quizzically, and this has to do with the proponents of this proposition has to do with some federal I don't want to call it overreach, but federal laws that are being interpreted to restrict the right to hunt on private property, the right to fish on private property, the right to, when it says harvest wildlife, it could be deer hunting, bird hunting. And this is basically an express statement in the Texas Constitution that says you have a right as a Texas citizen to hunt, fish, and harvest wildlife on private property subject to local laws. Prop 7 is a constitutional amendment dedicating certain sales and use tax revenue and motor vehicles tax. Boy, let me start over. The constitutional amendment dedicating certain sales and use tax revenue and motor vehicle sales, use, and rental tax revenue to the State Highway Fund to provide funding for non-tolled roads and the reduction of certain transportation-related debt. This is your transportation funding proposition. And what it does is it sets up, as part of our sales tax system, that over a certain amount, money goes into fund transportation that can only be used for non-tolled construction of roads and maintenance of roads. Those are the 7 propositions. If you want more information about those propositions, you can go to votetexas.gov. We'll give you a lot more information, a lot of detail on those propositions. Again, that is votetexas.gov. And with that, thank you guys so very much for the opportunity. Thank y'all. It was a pleasure.
We're going to let you go.
Thank you so much for accepting.
Oh, I'm glad to do it.
Glad to see you again.